In 1925, 10 years after Gandhi left South Africa, he first began writing and publishing his autobiography. Gandhi introduces his autobiography by stating, "It is not my purpose to attempt a real autobiography. I simply want to tell the story of my numerous experiments with truth, as my life consists of nothing but these experiments." A large portion of Gandhi's autobiography consists of relating the events of his time spent in South Africa. Two claims particularly resonate with a modern audience. First, Gandhi claims that he was the victim of racial prejudice in what year? 1893. After buying a first-class train ticket, he writes that he was thrown off the train for being a colored man, riding in a first-class compartment. In his autobiography, he says that this made him ask, "Should I fight for my rights or go back to India?" According to Gandhi, he decides, "It would be cowardice to run back to India without fulfilling my obligation. The hardship to which I was subjected was superficial, only a symptom of the deep disease of color prejudice. I should try, if possible, to root out the disease and suffer hardships in the process." Second, Gandhi talks about how he joined the British Army in 1906 during a war to suppress an uprising of Zulus against the colonial British government. He claims that his motivation for enlisting with the army which was fighting against the Zulus was to provide medical care for the Zulus. Gandhi writes, "To hear every morning reports of the soldiers' rifles exploding like crackers in innocent hamlets, and to live in the midst of them, was a trial. But I swallowed the bitter draught, especially as the work of my corps consisted only in nursing the wounded Zulus. I could see that but for us, the Zulus would have been uncared for. My heart was with the Zulus. I was delighted that our main work was to be the nursing of the wounded Zulus." So a lot could be said about Gandhi's life in South Africa, about how he started an ashram, about how he founded a newspaper called The Indian Opinion, about how he collaborated with the Reverend Joseph Doak and commissioned this man to write a biography of himself, of Gandhi. How Gandhi traveled to England to find a publisher for his own biography. How Gandhi expressed his desire to buy out the whole of the edition. Or how Gandhi worked to distribute complimentary copies of his biography to newspapers and famous people around the world. Instead of talking about these things, let's discuss claims in Gandhi's autobiography that, 1, he joined the British Army to help Zulus wounded by British soldiers, and 2, that his goal in South Africa was to root out the disease of color prejudice. Conflict between the Zulus and the colonial government began smoldering in 1905. In 1906, it ignited into full-out war. Next slide, please. The Zulu War is actually more commonly known today as the Bambata Uprising, and it's considered the beginning of the African struggle against apartheid-style policies in South Africa. The war began after Zulus killed 2 British tax collectors to protest a new head tax, a poll tax that was applied based on each individual person. Each individual in the community had to pay a tax for existing. So from February to July 1906, the Zulu chief Bambata led his people in an armed struggle against colonial oppression in South Africa. In his 1925 autobiography, Gandhi claims that he learned of the war through the newspapers, writing, "The papers brought the news of the outbreak of the Zulu rebellion. I bore no grudge against the Zulus. They had harmed no Indian. I had doubts about the rebellion itself." Now, do Gandhi's writings during the Zulu War tell the same story as his writings from 20 years after the war in his autobiography when he first told the world about what he did during that war? Do they? In 1905 articles in his newspaper, The Indian Opinion, Gandhi was already asking for Indians to be included in the British Army. In November 1905, 3 months before the Zulu rebellion began, Gandhi writes, "If the government only realized what reserve force is being wasted, they would make use of it and give Indians the opportunity of a thorough training for actual warfare." In December 1905, Gandhi praises a law allowing the colonial government to raise a force of Indian immigrants, volunteer infantry. This law, he argues, permits Indians the opportunity to participate in actual warfare. Drawing on his expertise as an attorney, Gandhi writes, "If the government only wanted the Indian immigrant to take his share in the defense of the colony, which he has before now shown himself to be quite willing to do, there is legal machinery ready-made for it." In March 1906, Gandhi publishes a plea for Indians to volunteer in the British Army, writing, "The Natal native trouble is dragging on a slow existence. The white colonists are trying to cope with it, and many citizen soldiers have taken up arms." Gandhi suggests that the conflict would end swiftly if the colonial government only made use of the military strength of the Indians. He writes, "There is a population of over 100,000 Indians in Natal, South Africa. It has been proved that they can do very efficient work in time of war." In April 1906, Gandhi describes the conflict between the Zulus and the British. The colonial government faced a tough fight, is what Gandhi suggested. He writes, "The region in which Bambata is operating as an outlaw is in difficult terrain full of bushes and trees where the..." And here, I'm going to use a word that Gandhi used frequently. And the only reason I'm going to use it in so many words is because Gandhi's writings at this time are sprinkled with it. And it's impossible to quote him or to vocally read the things that he wrote without using this word. It's a word which in South Africa is actually a criminal offense to use. And it's a word which is considered a racial slur. And I use it only as I quote Gandhi. Describing the conflict between the Zulus and the British Empire, Gandhi writes, "The region in which Bambata, the Zulu chieftain, is operating as an outlaw is in difficult terrain full of bushes and trees where the Kafirs can remain in hiding for long periods. To find them out and force a fight is a difficult job." After painting this picture, Gandhi then asks, what is our duty during these calamitous times in the colony? And he writes, "It is our duty to render whatever help we can. If the government so desires, we should raise an ambulance corps. we should also agree to become permanent volunteers. The common people in this country keep themselves in readiness for war. We too should contribute our share. Again, in April 1906, Gandhi complains about the criminal folly of not utilizing the admirable material the Indian community offers for additional defensive purposes of the colony. The right move, he argues, was to train Indians to fight. Gandhi writes, "It is surely elementary wisdom to give the Indian population an adequate military training." Finally, in May 1906, Gandhi writes an appeal for Indians to volunteer for the British Army. He complains, however, the pity of it is that the government has not taken the elementary precaution of giving the necessary discipline and instruction to the Indians. It is therefore a matter of physical impossibility to expect Indians to do any work with the rifle. Well, Gandhi considered it a pity the Indians had not been adequately trained to use rifles. He was convinced that the community could still serve as a great asset in times of war. And he concludes, it cannot be seriously argued that there is any wisdom or statesmanship in blindly refusing to make use of, for the purposes of war, 100,000 Indians. In June 1906, the colonial government finally accepted Gandhi's demands to form an Indian Corps. As Gandhi writes, acceptance by the government synchronizes with the amendment of the Firearms Act for the supply of arms to the Indians. Although the Indian Corps was formed as a temporary body, Gandhi was still not entirely satisfied. He explains, should Indians be assigned a permanent part in the militia, there will remain no ground for the European complaint that Europeans alone have to bear the brunt of colonial defense. Subsequently, Gandhi began encouraging Indians to subscribe to a soldiers' fund to support the British Empire's troops in battle. Indians, he argued, should go to the front and fight, but he insists that those who could not do so should raise a fund for the purpose of sending the soldiers fruits, tobacco, warm clothing, and other things that they might need. Why? Well, because, writes Gandhi, it is our duty to subscribe to such a fund. So, the Indian Corps was assigned to work as a stretcher bearer corps. But Gandhi viewed it as an opportunity to get his foot in the door and to start working towards a bigger goal, creation of an armed Indian Corps. Writing in June 1906, Gandhi explains his strategy. The stretcher bearer corps is to last only a few days. Its work will be only to carry the wounded, and it will be disbanded when such work is no longer necessary. The move for a volunteer corps is quite different and much more important. That corps will be a permanent body. Its members will be issued weapons, and they will receive military training every year. In the last newspaper article Gandhi writes before going to the battlefield, he issues a stirring call for other Indians to join him. There is hardly any family from which someone has not gone to fight the Kafir rebels, declares Gandhi. Following their example, we should steel our hearts and take courage. Now is the time when the leading whites want us to take this step. Next slide, please. Gandhi then went to war in June 1906. He was appointed as a British Sergeant Major, and you can see him pictured here, the little red circle right around him, in the center of his Indian stretcher bearer corps. From the battlefield, Gandhi sent back regular dispatches to his newspaper, the Indian Opinion. And from June 26 to July 19, a short 3-week period, the Indian Corps was at war, serving with the British colonial forces in an armed struggle to suppress an uprising of black Africans against colonial oppression. Of course, Gandhi's autobiography says that his heart was with the Zulus, and his work consisted of nursing wounded Zulus. I want to ask all of you to keep that in mind for the next few moments as we go over his battlefield reports, his dispatches from the battle. From these, we read on June 26 that some Indians did have to dress the wounds on the backs of several native rebels who had received lashes from the British. On June 27, the Corps had to take a stretcher to carry one of the British troopers who was dazed, and also assist in treating a wounded British trooper and others who had received slight injuries. On June 28, the Corps had to take a British private whose toe was crushed under a wagon wheel. On July 3, Gandhi says, we had a narrow escape when we met a Kafir who did not wear the loyal badge. He was armed. However, we safely rejoined the British troops. On July 10, after narrowly escaping from a Zulu who did not wear the loyal badge, Gandhi reports, we finished the day with no Kafirs to fight. The Corps did, however, help one wounded Zulu, and Gandhi reports that a Kafir, a friendly boy who did wear the loyal badge, was mistakenly shot by a British trooper. The boy was badly wounded and required carrying. And finally, on July 11, Gandhi reports that the Indian Corps was assigned about 20 Kafirs to help us. Describing his experience working with these black African Zulus, Gandhi states, the natives in our hands proved to be most unreliable and obstinate. Without constant attention, they would as soon have dropped the wounded man as not. Shortly after, the war ended. The Indian Corps went home. Next slide, please. The outcome of this war was a British victory, a resounding British victory, an overwhelming British victory, with 36 British killed. On the other side, the Zulu side, as many as 4,000 were killed, 4,000 were flogged, and 7,000 were imprisoned. Gandhi, however, was very pleased with the role that he played in the British Army during this war. In August 1906, he reports, members of the Corps were all untrained and untried men. They were called upon to do responsible and independent work and to face danger unarmed. Indians, Gandhi insists, had proved themselves capable of actual warfare. And so, writes Gandhi, if the government would form a permanent ambulance corps, I think that special training is absolutely necessary and that they should all be armed for self-protection. Perhaps Gandhi's decision to participate in the war against the Zulus can be understood in context of his opinion of the black Africans. In 1906, in November 1906, 3 months after this war ended, Gandhi claims that there are, quote, evident and sharp distinctions that undoubtedly exist between British Indians and the Kafir races in South Africa. And throughout previous years, Gandhi details his opinion. Next slide, please. In 1905, when the colonial government allowed Africans to attend the same school as Indians, Gandhi writes to the government in protest. He says, "The decision to open the school for all colored children is unjust to the Indian community." He asks that the school will be reserved for Indian children only. Earlier that year, Gandhi claims that Indian labor is in high demand because the Kafirs are of no use. And the Kafir hardly works. In 1904, when the government was allowing Africans to share neighborhoods with Indians, Gandhi complains, writing, "The town council must withdraw the Kafirs from the location. About this mixing of the Kafirs with the Indians, I must confess I feel most strongly. I think it is very unfair to the Indian population, and it is an undue tax on even the proverbial patience of my countrymen." In 1903, Gandhi protests against a new tax, a head tax, which applied equally to both Africans and Indians. Gandhi suggests, whereas Kafirs are to be taxed because they do not work at all or sufficiently, we, Indians, are to be taxed evidently because we work too much. The only thing in common between the two communities, black Africans and Indians, the only thing in common between the two communities being the absence of white skin. Speaking of white-skinned people, in 1903, Gandhi also declares, of course, welcome. Speaking of white-skinned people, in 1903, Gandhi also declares, "We Indians believe as much in the purity of race as we think the whites do. Only we believe that they would best serve the interest, which is as dear to us as it is to them, by advocating the purity of all the races and not one alone. We believe also that the white race of South Africa should be the predominating race." And in 1899, Gandhi writes, "Indians are undoubtedly infinitely superior to the Kafirs." So, finally, Gandhi presents his general opinion of black Africans in 1896. They were, he insisted, pitted against the Indian community. He writes, "Ours is one continual struggle against a degradation sought to be inflicted upon us by the Europeans, who desire to degrade us to the level of the raw kafir, whose occupation is hunting, and whose sole ambition is to collect a certain number of cattle to buy a wife with, and then pass his life in indolence and nakedness. Next slide, please. Do you all recall the 1895 Durban post office incident that I opened with? What happened during that incident? Does anybody remember? 1895 in Durban, South Africa. Gandhi had a problem with the post office. Indians and Africans had to share the same door. Had to share the same door. And they could not enter the door that the whites did. There were two doors. It was a racially segregated society system. What was Gandhi's problem with that? Was his problem that all the communities should be allowed equality and they were being denied it? What was his protest? Who wants to take a stab at it? Yeah, go ahead.
Did he say he wanted a door for, I think he used the word Asiatics, or European? Sorry. European?
So Europeans, Africans, and Asiatics in his words. And Europeans had one door. There were how many doors? Two doors. Who shared the second door? All coloreds. And what did Gandhi demand? A separate door for? Okay. So as Gandhi writes, correspondence was carried on with the government in connection with the separate entrances for the Europeans and natives and Asiatics at the post office. As a result of Gandhi's legal efforts, colonial South Africa's two-tiered system of racial segregation became a three-tiered system as blacks were separated from Indians. Indians no longer had to share a door with native black Africans. In other words, fulfilling Gandhi's request, Indians and blacks were racially segregated. Again, fulfilling Gandhi's request.